all. I'll get going. For those of you joining us for the first time tonight, my name is Bethany Gaunt, and I am Associate Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. The name Martin Gilbert, for an audience of Churchill enthusiasts, will likely be rather familiar. Sir Martin was Churchill's official biographer, and he wrote a number of books on Sir Winston. Indeed, Martin Gilbert was a prolific writer, publishing 88 books on a wide range of 20th century topics. And our centre aims to honour his legacy by bringing engaging and accessible research on the areas he worked on to wide audiences. The centre is a charity, and so we rely on donations. If you enjoy our talks, please do consider supporting us. It's easy to donate on our website, and I will post the link in the chat in a few minutes. We're very grateful for your support, which enables us to keep putting on free events such as this. Now, I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Ms. Candice Millard. I watched her at the International Churchill Conference last year and immediately put her at the top of my wish list for the centre. Ms. Millard has written a number of New York Times bestsellers, including The River of Doubt, Destiny of the Republic, and of course the book she will speak to us about tonight, Hero of the Empire. And if you haven't yet read Hero of the Empire, you must. It is an electrifying read and brings a young, ambitious Winston Churchill to life. Ms. Millard has a huge number of accolades, including the Edgar Award for Best Fact Crime and the Penn Center USA Award for Research Nonfiction. Alongside her books, Ms. Millard has written for The Atlantic, The Guardian, National Geographic, and Time magazine, and tonight she will be speaking to us about Hero of the Empire and Sir Winston's time as he escaped captivity in South Africa. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end, so please, as always, post those in the chat or send them to me directly and I'll handle them at the end. We are truly grateful to have you here tonight, Candice. Thank you so much for joining us. Without further ado, I will pull up your presentation and hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Bethany. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate you joining us and taking the time. I have to say it's such an honor to be speaking to you, to be invited to speak by the Sir Martin Gilbert Center. Like all of you, I'm sure, I don't know anyone, whether they are writers or simply readers, who doesn't have immense respect for Sir Martin Gilbert and the work that he did. And for someone like me who has written about Churchill, Sir Martin was and will always be a tremendous source of knowledge and inspiration. He was simply the best. He was the top of the heap. So again, I thank you sincerely for this honor. When most of us think of Winston Churchill, we think of this man. Next slide, please. He is virtually a synonym for great leadership. He is a master politician, a savior of his country during World War II, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, and one of the most famous human beings in history. But the problem with trying to understand a leader at the height of his career is that we often end up talking about the results of that person's character, not the forces that created it. What I was trying to understand while I was working on this book is where that man came from. What gave him the courage, the insight, and the will to become such a towering figure? So today I'm going to talk about this man. Next slide, please. He's 24 years old. He has just left the military, the only job he's ever had, the only job for which he has been trained. He has no money. He's already tried to run for office and lost. He is like so many other children of privilege then and now who amount to nothing. So how do we connect this young man to the legend he later became? What made the Winston Churchill we all know? How did he become one of the most powerful and effective leaders mankind has ever produced? I believe that an important part of the answer lies in an exceptional series of events, which I described in this book. It is a story of what happened when young Winston Churchill went to the Boer War in South Africa in 1899. Churchill didn't plan this story, and he couldn't have predicted it, but in every sense, he prepared for it, he understood its significance, he seized control of it, he risked everything to succeed in it, and he turned that opportunity into a life-changing moment that was directly responsible for his later path to power. There is a saying that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity, and that is exactly what happened here. Churchill was only in Africa for a matter of months, but what happened there put the spark to the combustible mixture of intelligence, ambition, courage, and resourcefulness that defined him from his earliest years. It transformed the young man you see here into a world-famous hero, setting him firmly on the path to greatness. And in doing so, it also transformed the world we live in today. Before I talk about the Boer War and the action that takes place in this book, I'd like to introduce you to young Churchill. He comes from a famous family. He's a direct descendant of the first Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill. Next slide, please. Who is considered to be one of the greatest generals in British history. His father, next slide, please. Lord Randolph Churchill, the third son of the seventh Duke, was Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons. And Winston was born here, next slide, please, at Blenheim Palace, the estate given to John Churchill by Queen Anne after the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. Churchill, however, would never inherit either the title or the palace. He had no income, and his father, who had died a very public and tragic death when Churchill was only 20 years old, had left him very little money, most of which his mother had already spent. The good news was that he was naturally brilliant. He was also an exceptional writer, and he knew it. In fact, he had already written 3 books, including his first and only novel, Savonarola. And he quickly discovered that he could make a living as a journalist, covering every war he encountered. But being a journalist was never going to be enough for Winston Churchill. He was fascinated with power and consumed by dreams of glory. Next slide, please. He had trained to be a soldier and he loved war. In fact, even though he was only 24 years old, he had already been involved in 3 different wars on 3 different continents. And he was willing to take any risk to be noticed. He had nearly been killed many times, bullets whistling by his head, once killing the horse that had been standing right next to him, another time in a later war, severing the jaunty feather from the top of his hat. He had killed men himself, once coming so close to his victim that his pistol struck the man as Churchill galloped by. And he had seen his friends not just killed, but mutilated, sliced to ribbons by their enemies. Even with all he had seen and experienced, Churchill continued to seek out the most brutal battles the British Empire had to offer. He was the first to sign up and the first to show off, however he could. He even, to the astonishment and horror of the men around him, rode a white pony during a battle in British India, just in the hope of being noticed. He said, given an audience, there is no act too daring or too noble. Without the gallery, things are different. Churchill was impatient to succeed and excel, to make his mark on the world. But no matter what he did, he couldn't get a foothold. The military was too slow for him, so he quit. He ran for his first seat in Parliament in the summer of 1899, but was rejected by voters. So frustrated and burning with ambition, Churchill feverishly looked for his next opportunity, knowing that it was his destiny to lead. As he told his mother, he had faith in his star. Just 4 months later, war broke out in Southern Africa. To the British, this was just another colonial war, one that was expected to be over in a matter of months, certainly by Christmas. Unfortunately, they had forgotten who they were fighting. The Boers had been living in South Africa for centuries, and in that time they had transformed from rogue splinter groups of largely Dutch, Huguenot, and German immigrants into an entirely new ethnic group, neither European nor African, but Boer. They had even developed their own language, Afrikaans, which mixes Dutch with everything from French and Portuguese to Khoi. They were highly religious, unabashedly racist, and stubbornly independent. Most of all, they just wanted to be left alone. An attempt to get away from the British in 1835, just 2 years after the British Empire had abolished slavery, they had moved hundreds of miles from the Cape into the African interior on what became known as a Great Trek, establishing 3 colonies of their own. Their independence, however, had lasted only as long as their poverty. In the mid-1800s, diamonds and then gold were discovered in the Transvaal, one of the Boer republics, transforming the region from one of the poorest in the world to one of the wealthiest. Next slide, please. Paul Kruger, who would become president of the Transvaal, predicted that this gold will cause our country to be soaked in blood, and he was right. By 1877, Britain had annexed the Transvaal, a move that quickly led to the First Boer War in 1880. Nearly 20 years later, in the fall of 1899, little had changed. The British still wanted the Boers' land, and the Boers still insisted on their independence. The British Empire began amassing troops at Transvaal borders, and the atmosphere, Churchill wrote, gradually but steadily became tense, charged with electricity, laden with the presage of storm. Finally, the Boers issued an ultimatum: stand down or prepare for war. The British, thrilled to have an excuse to go to war, allowed the deadline for the ultimatum to pass with little more than a sneer. 3 days after the war began, Winston Churchill, seeing his opportunity, was on a ship to South Africa, hired to cover the war as a correspondent. Churchill had never really followed the rules. His mother, the beautiful American socialite born Jenny Jerome, next slide, please, had used her influence time and again to help her son win military appointments. This is a pushing age, Churchill had explained to her. We must push with the best. Since leaving Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, he had used every connection she had and every skill he had to promote himself. Now he was the highest paid correspondent England had ever had, and he was eager for the adventure that lay ahead. In South Africa, however, the situation had quickly begun to deteriorate. The British had seriously underestimated the Boers. Not only were they extraordinary marksmen with better weapons than the British, but they knew every nook and cranny of the South African veldt and could disappear without a trace, making them an invisible and very dangerous enemy. The British, in stark contrast, had only recently and very reluctantly begun dragging their military into the modern world. Next slide, please. Sir Redvers Buller, Commander-in-Chief of Her Majesty's Army in South Africa, had been nicknamed the Steamroller because the British believed that he would make quick work of the Boers. His men, however, had only recently traded in their dashing red coats for khakis, which they bitterly complained made them look like bus drivers. And they continued to fight in perfect precise lines, spreading themselves across the flat South African veldt like a picture in a storybook, served up for slaughter. By the time Churchill reached South Africa, the British Army had already been humiliated by the Boers, losing the first battles and leaving the British stunned and scrambling to adjust to this new kind of warfare. As soon as Churchill arrived, with his valet, of course, as well as a nice selection of wine, a light port, a French vermouth, and 18 bottles of 10-year-old Scotch whiskey, he went as far and as fast as he could toward the front, which was now Ladysmith. Next slide, please. By the time he arrived, however, the Boers had completely cut it off. No one could get in or out of Ladysmith. I was too late, Churchill wrote dismally. The door was shut. Next slide, please. So he was forced to make camp just 40 miles outside of Ladysmith in a little town called Escourt. Just 9 days later, as a heavy rain fell in the morning of November 15th, Churchill climbed aboard the British Army's armored train. Next slide, please. His old friend from his days in the military, Elmer Halden, had been ordered to take the train out for reconnaissance. Both men knew it was a foolish, potentially disastrous decision. Not only was the train an easy target on the best of days, but the Boers had been spotted outside of Escourt only days before. Halden had no choice but to go. Churchill, on the other hand, did. But frustrated, restless, and, as he would later admit, eager for trouble, he did not hesitate for a moment when Halden invited him to go along. Next slide, please. Before the sun came up that morning, Churchill had climbed into the first train car, an open truck from which he would have the best vantage. Behind him, stretching down the tracks, were another armored car filled with men in their khaki uniforms and peaked helmets, the engine with its wide-mouthed black funnel and narrow tender, two more armored cars, and finally, an ordinary low-sided car that held tools and a few plate layers. As the train cut across the veldt, the Boers were silently and invisibly watching, led by a respected and daring young general named Louis Botha. Next slide, please. Who would later become the first Prime Minister of South Africa. Botha knew not only where the train was going, he knew it would have to come back on the same tracks. As soon as the train passed them, he ordered his men to move to the bottom of the hill and begin piling rocks on the tracks. When the train, on its way back to Escourt, appeared at the top of the hill, the Boers opened fire, chasing it down the steep slope until it crashed into the stones at the bottom, catapulting the first two cars off the tracks, killing several men, horribly wounding others, and trapping them all in a hailstorm of shells and bullets. Next slide, please. Although he was only a journalist, one of the few civilians on the train, and again, just 24 years old, Winston Churchill immediately took charge of the defense, shouting orders as he ran back and forth from the engine to the last truck, organizing the men in a desperate attempt to free the train. In the end, he succeeded, and every man who made it out alive credited Churchill's resourcefulness and bravery for saving their lives. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, Churchill wasn't there to accept their gratitude or hear their praise. He'd been captured and was taken to Pretoria as a prisoner of war. Next slide, please. For Churchill, captivity was unbearable. He would never forget how it felt. Many years later, he wrote, "You feel a sense of constant humiliation in being confined to a narrow space, fenced in by railings and wire, watched by armed men. I certainly hated every minute of my captivity more than I have ever hated any other period in my whole life." From the moment he became a prisoner, Churchill resolved to escape. Finally, with 2 other men, he had a plan. Next slide, please. A 6.5-foot tall iron paling surrounded their prison, the Stotts Meadow School, which was constantly patrolled by armed guards. When the electric lights came on at night, however, one corner of the yard remained dark. If one of the guards turned his back at just the right moment, they could make their move. After much discussion and careful planning, they chose their night. But when the time came, Churchill's co-conspirators found themselves trapped inside in the glare of the lights and the eyes of the guards. Churchill, who had already scaled the fence, suddenly realized that he was alone. Next slide, please. Facing the prospect of crossing nearly 300 miles of enemy territory with no map, no compass, no food, no weapon, no ability to speak the language, and with the Boers who were humiliated and enraged in hot pursuit. What Churchill did have was an absolute faith in his destiny and a clear-eyed understanding that this was a chance he had been waiting for. The story of Churchill's escape is an epic adventure by any standard. And if you don't already know the story, how he survived it, I won't ruin it for you. Next slide. But I will say that by the time it was over, Churchill was not only a free man, he rode back to Pretoria as part of a British regiment, took over the prison, released the men who had been his fellow prisoners, captured the jailers, and watched as the Boer flag was torn down and the British flag hoisted in its place. But more important than the story itself is what it meant to Churchill as a person, as a leader, and as an architect of the world we now live in. After he returned home from South Africa, he was what he had always dreamed of being, a hero of the empire. A famous man now, Churchill ran for parliament again, and this time he won. Next slide, please. His life and British politics would never be the same. If Churchill had previously dreamed about the power of his will and his destiny, now he had proof, and he was unstoppable. He had not only been part of a great adventure, but he had done it alone. He would approach life and politics with an unshakable faith in his own abilities that would not only define his leadership, but provide a foundation of courage and confidence that inspired entire nations. Churchill would also carry the humbling lessons of this experience throughout his life. He understood better than almost any other major leader the enormous cost and tragedy of war. He was extremely compassionate about the plight of prisoners and determined to reach out the hand of friendship to those who had so lately been his enemies. As high as Churchill rose in the political stratosphere, he would never forget his capture, his imprisonment, or his escape from the Boers. As he himself would write, "This misfortune, could I have foreseen the future, was to lay the foundations of my later life." Those foundations in turn would help to support and shape much of the world we know today. Of course, Churchill didn't know that at the time, but I don't think it would have come as a surprise. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating and tantalizing insight into what you describe in your book in great detail. And as I said at the start, I would so highly recommend reading Hero of the Empire, because you do painstakingly in it reconstruct exactly what he went through. And so I wonder if I can kick off the questions by asking how did you conduct the research? How did you go about creating this book, this detailed account of such a treacherous time in Churchill's life?
Well, I always say the research is my favorite part of any book that I work on, and this in particular was really exciting. Obviously, I did a lot of archival research. in the UK, and you know, I spent quite a bit of time doing research there. But then I always try to go to where the story played out, if I can, and I've been lucky enough to be able to do that. And in this case, obviously, that was in South Africa and a little bit in Mozambique. And you know, I think for most of the world, certainly very few Americans know anything about the Boer War. And I think even in the UK, it's been largely forgotten. But in South Africa, as you can imagine, it's not been. And there's still so much there. But especially even for this story alone, there was so much there. So I was able to go to where he was captured. I was able to go to where he was kept as a POW in Pretoria. The building was, you know, originally a school, but it, you know, then it became POW camp, and now it's a library. It's just a public library.
Wow.
But it's incredible. They've tried to hold on to the history. So, you know, these men who were held there, this was an officer's prison, and many of them were highly trained cartographers. And so they have on the wall of one of the rooms a map that these men drew, charting the course of the war. And there's just like some plexiglass over it, but you can see it. I was in the room where Churchill was kept, where there's still a trap door in the floor where they
Wow.
had thought about tunneling their way, you know, under the garden to get out. And I stood in there. I went to where he had hidden. And a colliery with white rats, you know, down in a coal mine. The colliery is gone, but you can still see where the mine shaft was. And I went into Mozambique, and there's still the same building that was the British consulate when he was there, and they have a little plaque up calling it, I think it's Winston's Garden or Churchill's Garden or something like that. But even more than that, seeing all these places, seeing where the story played out, are meeting the people who truly understand this part of the world and understand. Like, for instance, I met many people who worked in these coal mines for many years, managed them, and they were able to tell me things that I just would have never known on my own about what it would have been like to be in this coal mine shaft for days, you know. And I had thought, for instance, oh, it's going to be dark and tight, but actually it's pretty wide because they send ponies down there. These poor ponies will go down for weeks. I mean, it's heartbreaking, but you can imagine what it smelled like too. So those kinds of, and I met a man who had spent years and years trying to figure out exactly where. So Churchill, when he escaped, at one point he jumped on a train and was hiding there, and then he jumps off again, and then he ends up, by this miraculous stroke of luck, knocking on the one door where there was a British man who could help him, right? And this man had spent years, even decades, trying to figure out exactly where Churchill had jumped off the train. And he had shown me, like, so this is the little hill that he was under, and this is probably the pond where he got some water, and this is the grouping of trees. So you just can't skip that part. You know, you can't. Obviously, you need the diaries and letters, and this was rich with that, and you need the archives, and I love that. But to go to where it played out and to kind of really understand the environment in which he was, it was just hugely helpful in writing the book.
I bet. You can definitely tell that the lengths you went to research it when you're reading it. It is fantastic.
Thank you.
We've got some lots of love for your book in the chat as well. But I'll pick another question. So we have, how do you think Winston's escape furthered his political and career plans later?
I mean, I think that this is what launched his political career. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to tell the story. You know, I don't write cradle to grave biographies. I try to find a moment in someone's life that is illuminating about that person, but also about that time in their life. So even though the story might take place over just a few months, and it's sort of targeted and narrow in a way, it has to have a larger importance, right? And one of those things was the fact that, to my mind, this was the launching of Winston Churchill's career. So one of the most important political careers in human history. And as I said, so he had tried to run for office before and had lost. And he knew, he called war the glittering gateway to distinction. So he knew that was his best way to get attention, and that would propel him to sort of public prominence, and then he hoped political power. And that's exactly what happened here, because like I said, even though he wasn't, I mean, he went there as a journalist, right? But it's just was his instinct to immediately take action. And the British, again, were shocked that they were losing the war. That didn't happen, right? This was just going to be another colonial war, but they really underestimated their enemy. And so they were, the morale was really down. And then here comes this brave young man, right, who makes this incredibly daring escape from this prominent family. And when he escaped, like, nobody knew where he was, right? He just went off the radar, and they knew that the Boers were searching for him. If they found him, would probably kill him. So everyone was wondering what had happened to Winston Churchill. And when he comes out triumphant, Mozambique, I mean, it was huge. And so everyone knew his name. If they didn't before, they did now. And he was obviously very smart, very politically savvy. And so as quickly as he could, he ran again, and he won. And that launched his political career.
Amazing. And you describe in the book how it's fortuitous, the timing of his re-emergence in there, because it comes at a time when Britain needs a real boost, doesn't it,
Right.
in the war? It's sort of
Exactly.
not going well.
Yeah,
Morale is
they're like,
low.
wait, we don't lose. No, and they're like, okay, we've got this hero. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. How long was Churchill imprisoned for, and how long roughly did his escape take? Do we know?
Right. So yes, this all happened really quickly. So he leaves for South Africa in mid-October. He's captured mid-November. He escapes mid-December, and then it takes him about 10 days to make it to Mozambique. But again, I mean, it's just mind-boggling. I keep thinking, this would be an incredible story if it happened to anybody, but that it happened to Winston Churchill is just astonishing. But imagine traveling almost 300 miles by yourself. You don't have anything, you don't know the land, you don't have a map. Again, no weapon, no food, no compass, nothing. And just, I mean, to me, what was so striking is that all of these qualities that he used, and that you see in this very young man, he turned 25 in the POW camp. His courage, his resourcefulness, his determination, his audacity, all those things got him through that. And all of those things are, what gets the rest, the modern world, Western world through World War II, 40 years later. So you see those same very Churchillian qualities in this very young man.
Absolutely. He wasn't the only person to escape from the camp, was he? The people that he was originally going to leave with also managed to get out. And was their reception similar, or was Churchill a sort of special case?
He was always
Yeah.
a special case. But so for those of you who don't know it, it was really galling. So what happened was, so Churchill gets to this POW camp, and he knows, a couple of the other people, and Halden, who is the guy who had invited him, his old friend who had invited him on the train, and is feeling kind of guilty, like it's sort of his fault that Churchill's there. But he comes up with a plan to escape, and he comes up with this plan with this guy who's this really scrappy, kind of tough guy who speaks all these languages, who does know South Africa really well. And again, is just this really resourceful guy. And they come up with this idea that they notice this corner that's dark at this certain time, and they were watching the guards and their habits. And so they have this plan that they're going to get over the fence. And Churchill finds out, and he's like, hey, can I join you in this plan? And they say, no, we don't want you, because first of all, you're not in good enough shape. And secondly, you're famous. Your dad is this very famous person. They'll definitely come looking for you. And then finally, you talk too much. You're going to tell everybody. You can't keep a secret, right? And so Halden again is feeling kind of guilty, and so he says to Churchill, look, we don't want you to come with us, but I'm not going to stop you because I feel like it's my fault. And Churchill says, okay, I'm coming anyway. And then only he gets over, he didn't plan it. He didn't try to leave them behind. Obviously he didn't want to leave them behind. And they had all the supplies and everything, but he's the first to get over. Again, it's just his audacity. He takes a chance when they're being more cautious. And then it's too late. The moment has passed. He's on the other side of the fence. He can't get back in. They can't get out. So he's on his own. So yes, they end up the POW camp ends up being moved to a different location, and these men are later able to escape, and they kind of go the same route and are helped by some of the same people that Churchill was. But no, I mean, all eyes are on Winston Churchill now.
It's understandable, really.
Yep, as would be for the next many years.
Yeah. So someone has asked, and I know this is a bit of a bone of was a bit of a bone of contention for Churchill, but at the time of his capture, was Churchill a civilian journalist for the Morning Post, or had he officially rejoined the army?
At his capture, he was still just a journalist. So it's interesting. So, he had been, as I said, in counting this war, 3 different wars on 3 different continents by the time he's 24 years old. And in one of those, and again, he's surviving. He's making a living as a journalist, but he was also in those wars, he was a journalist and a soldier. But because of him, they finally had to make a rule that you couldn't be both, because in the hierarchy of the British military, they were so tired of him criticizing them. Again, he's this young man and thinks he knows better than everybody else, right? People are much older, much more experienced, and often he's right, and they don't like that. And so they finally say, you've got to choose. And so at this point, he was just a journalist. Now, after he escaped and he becomes a huge hero, he's pulled aside, and they're like, thank you. Again, he's raising morale. Is there anything we can do for you? And he says, yes, I want to be in a regiment. Put me in a regiment, and I want to go back. And that's when he's able to go back to Pretoria and then help free the other men who he had been imprisoned with, who were still imprisoned, and help them out. And so then he was able to muddy those waters again, being Winston Churchill. But no, at the time of his capture, he was just a civilian journalist.
And one person's asked a question, which is, how do you feel Winston's relationship with his father shaped the personality of the young Winston you covered in your book? That's a bit of a tricky one.
Right. No, I think it had a lot to do with it. It's interesting to me. Obviously, I had and I'm having a very, very different life from Winston Churchill, including my childhood. I grew up in a little blue collar town in Ohio, right? I didn't know anything about his world. But so it was very, very interesting to me to learn about his childhood, and heartbreaking, frankly, especially as a mother. He wanted nothing more than to be close to his parents. He said he adored his mother, but from a distance. And he obviously had great respect for his father, but he felt like he never had a chance to be close to him. He said he'd rather be a shop owner or a bricklayer, because then maybe would have had a chance to work with his father and come to know his father. But his mother was always, she was very beautiful and very social and always having parties, and his father was very serious and busy. And they, time and again, he would beg them to visit him at school, and they never would. And his father was really hard on him. I mean, some of the letters he wrote to him would just break your heart. And Churchill wanted nothing more than to please his father and impress him. And so I think that his father cast a shadow over him throughout his entire life. And absolutely, I think, I mean, it's true of all of us to some degree, right? We want to and make our parents proud. And that was absolutely the case with Winston Churchill.
Yeah. No, that does sound heartbreaking. And what comes across so vividly in your book is just this real desire to make a reputation and to sort of that overshadowing at any cost almost that I want
Right.
to be seen as brave and courageous and a driving force. And did the experiences in the war sort of satisfy that, or did that continue to be a driving force throughout, do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely continue to be a driving force. I mean, it's very interesting to me. I've written also about Theodore Roosevelt, who I think was a very similar personality to Winston Churchill. And in fact, they met and didn't like each other, and I think it's because they were too much alike. But these are men who just can't stop, and I think that. Um, that's hard sometimes for the next generations, because they're not willing to pass the baton. You take it from here. I mean, as we know, Winston Churchill lived to be 90 years old. He lived in some of the most important, tragic, crowded, momentous moments in history, and he was at the center of every single one, and would have continued to be had he continued to live. I mean, I honestly, sometimes people ask me, if you could meet Winston Churchill, what would you ask him? And I always say I would ask him, what's next? Because I think that honestly, he would have kept, it's just, I think that when you have that much ambition and you've worked so hard your entire life and you're taking incredible risks, and you also, I mean, he had just unbelievable knowledge and wisdom, and broad and deep. He was interested in everything, and he was good at everything. So I obviously, it's really interesting. Some people just have this unquenchable drive, and that's absolutely no one more than Winston Churchill.
Yeah, it's very clear.
Yeah.
Some brilliant questions coming through here. Someone's asked, do you have any plans to write any more about Winston Churchill in the future?
I mean, I would love to. There's so much, but I mean, I have to admit, so I've written 4 books, and this was definitely the most intimidating subject to take on. Not only is it Winston Churchill, but also, as we were talking about, with certainly again with Sir Martin Gilbert being at the top of this list. I mean, there's so many unbelievably skilled and knowledgeable and just dazzling historians who have written about him. And there's so many, obviously, different parts of his life. This was just, this in particular was a story I had heard years ago, and just was like, how do I not know that? How did I not know that Winston Churchill was a POW? What? And so I just kind of kept in my back pocket. And when I was ready to look for a new idea, I thought, oh my God, can I write about this? Am I brave enough to take on Winston Churchill? I think especially as an American, I remember when it came out, I'm talking to someone who was British and said, do you feel like you write like an American woman? And I was like, well, I am an American woman, so I guess so. I guess I write. I mean, I just tell the story the best way I know how. So I never say never, but I would have to find again a narrow story that has a lot of action and that I feel capable of doing justice to.
Yeah, that you could get completely on top of. Yeah,
Yes,
I can
exactly.
relate to that.
Yeah, I'm going to be intimidated either way, I know, but if I feel like, okay, I can get a handle on it, maybe.
Well, you certainly did this justice, so I wouldn't worry.
Thank you.
Are
Thank
there
you.
any other books on this subject that you would recommend to our readers?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So obviously, Churchill's book himself, My Early Years. If you haven't read it, any of you there, please immediately get it. It's one of my favorite books, probably my favorite book that he has written, and obviously because it covers this time. But he was obviously just an incredibly gifted writer, and it's fascinating, but it's also hilarious. I always tell my husband, I'll never forget when I was first starting research on this, and I was reading, I was like at lunch by myself, and I was sitting reading it, and I just like, spitting my soup everywhere because he's just so funny. He's just like, oh, he's so funny, but it's really, really insightful if you really want to understand who he was. not just this time, but really understanding. I think that's the book. Also, his granddaughter, Celia Sands, wrote a really great book about this moment in his life. And she too went to South Africa. Her story is more sort of from her perspective and going there as his granddaughter and taking her son and what it meant to them. I mean, it obviously tells the story, but it's a very unique perspective on him. And obviously you can't go wrong with Sir Martin Gilbert, who covers this beautifully and again, very intimidatingly for me. So yeah, there's a lot.
Brilliant, thank you. I know people like to go away and read up on it when they've had a brilliant
Yeah.
presentation. Someone has asked, simply put, what do you feel Winston learnt from the Boer War?
To me, I think what he learned was what he had always suspected. So in a personal sense, I think, he had always suspected that he could do this, that he could rise to the occasion, whatever the occasion was. And he again thrown himself into difficult and dangerous situations again and again and again already before this point. But this was extraordinary for anybody. And he did it, and he did it alone. And so I think that for anyone, especially a young person, even if you believe in yourself, if, as Churchill said, you have faith in your star, you have to be tested, right? And you have to prove it, not really to everybody else, but to yourself. And he did that. And I think that gave him an incredible confidence. And to me, what was most powerful about Winston Churchill as a leader was that confidence and the fact that it was contagious. So, right. So he believed in himself, but he also believed in you. And he knew, and that's what happened with this armored train, right? And there, it's people are dying, literally arms are being ripped off. There's this hail of bullets and shells. And he's telling them, keep going, we can do this, you go there, you go there. And people just immediately listened to this young man who wasn't even in the military, and they took orders from him, and they had this confidence. It's this contagious confidence that he just naturally had. But having that natural confidence and then having proven it to himself in a major way made him just unstoppable going forward.
Yeah. Amazing, thank you. We've probably got time for a couple more questions. I'm aware we've been firing at them at you very rapidly, so thank you for that. We have, did any of the men imprisoned with Churchill ever serve under him? I don't know if
That's
you're...
interesting. You know what? I'm not sure. I would think, World War I was just a few years later, and he was obviously very involved in World War I as World War II in different ways. So I'm not sure about that.
Possibly one for a
Yeah.
future book, maybe.
Yeah.
I was quite struck when I was reading your book towards the end when you discuss Kitchener's use of concentration camps,
Mhm.
and I wondered if there were any records or discussion about Churchill's views on that as a tactic.
Right. Well, so the concentration camps were a really interesting thing for me. I hadn't realized they had things like concentration camps had been used before, but that was the first time they had used the term. And so Kitchener sent in, let's wrap this up. This has been going on for years, but the Boers were not giving up. They were called the bitter enders, right? And they were not giving up. So Kitchener decides on this scorched earth policy, right? And he's burning everything down. Well, now they're left with these, because obviously the Boers would come in and they would get food and medicine and help from these families, right? And so they just burned everything down, and they're left with these women and children and don't know what to do with them. So they stick them in these concentration camps, and many of them just died from neglect. They didn't have enough food, they didn't have clean water, they didn't have medical care, and it was horrible. And slowly this comes out and kind of makes its way back to the British Empire, and people are horrified. Now, Churchill did say, he was like, and again, it's this sort of, okay, we are the civilized empire, right? And we have to, I think he used the term, avoid unnecessary cruelty to our enemies. And that's what he was referring to what was happening in the concentration camps. So he had, interestingly, like I said, he was always like, no one was quicker to fight, no one fought harder than Churchill, but also no one was faster to turn around and say, okay, let me help you, to the enemy. And he said, there was a lot of things about the Boers that he admired, certainly their refusal to give up, and their skill at fighting, and so I think that was fairly rare.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
A happier question. Did Churchill ever encounter the men that helped him to freedom afterwards? Did he ever see them again?
Yeah, so he got these gold watches, and he went back and gave gold watches to some of the people who had helped him. And I saw actually one of those. It's in a little, one of them is in a little museum in Durban, and you can see it. And they have some of the letters and things. A nice archive there. And I know that Celia Sand, when she went and she was doing her research, and she was interviewed by some like local radio stations and things like that, and she said that she was searching for some of these, and some people came forward, and they had been passed down. And so yeah, so he was able to thank many of the men who had risked so much, absolutely risked their lives to help him.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just to finish up, I wonder if you could tell us what your most recent book is about. We'd love to
Yes,
hear.
so it's I've got there are three main characters, and two of them are British again. So it's about the search for the source of the Nile. It's called River of the Gods, and it's about Sir Richard Francis Burton, who was this unbelievably brilliant, charismatic, spoke 25 different languages plus another 12 dialects, explorer, and John Hanning Speke. And it's a story of their friendship and the betrayal of that friendship, and the source of what was the search for what was then the holy grail of exploration. And then the third man, it was called Sidi Mubarak Bombay, and he had been kidnapped as a child from his home in East Africa. He had been enslaved for 20 years, and he really becomes one of the most accomplished guides and explorers in the history of African exploration.
Amazing. That sounds great. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
I think I've put a link to that in the chat if you're interested, but you can check out Candice's website as well. I think there's the links on there. Um, Thank you so much for this evening. It's been brilliant to hear more. I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book. I do recommend it. If
Thank
you've
you.
enjoyed tonight, then we've got an upcoming course with Alan Packwood, which is 4 weeks on Winston Churchill and the Second World War. So you might be interested in joining us for that. Our next talk will be on Monday, so just a few days' time, and that's with Lady Esther Gilbert, who will be doing a series of readings on the bombing of Dresden. It's the anniversary from Sir Martin's work, so do head to our website and join us. But thank you so much. That was brilliant, and there's lots of congratulations in the chat for you as well. So thank you everyone
Thank
for
you,
joining us,
Bethany.
and thank you so much for that
It
wonderful
was an honor and
presentation.
great pleasure. Thank you, everyone. All right. Good
Thanks
night.
and good night.
Goodbye.